Greetings once again from Cooperstown, New York, home of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. We thank you for joining us, our latest installment of the virtual author series coming at you today. Thank you for being with us. It's a sunny day, but a rather cool day here in Cooperstown in the low 30s. Yeah, winter just around the corner here in upstate New York. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Marcus, and I work for the Hall of Fame's Education Department. In just a moment, we are going to welcome author Steve Treder to our airwaves. Steve is going to be talking about his new book, 40 Years a Giant, The Life of Horace Stoneham, longtime owner of both the New York and then the San Francisco Giants after their move to the West Coast. Lots of good baseball conversation coming up. As always, today's virtual author series is brought to you by the Ford Motor Company. They are the sponsors for this program and all the others that we do. That's why we can offer them free of charge. We do thank the Ford Motor Company for their generous support throughout 2021. Our guest, an old friend, both to me and to the Baseball Hall of Fame, Steve Treder. Steve's a longtime historian and writer of the game. He has written for the Hardball Times, written for National Pastime, the Nine Baseball Journal. Also, if I'm not mistaken, now I'm gonna have to clarify this with Steve, I believe he did an ebook a number of years ago, but now his first published book in print, and it's a good one, 40 Years a Giant, The Life of Horace Stoneham. And this is not, the kind of light reading you can do in between innings while watching the World Series. This is in-depth. It is very detailed, goes through the entire career and life of Horace Stoneham. We will talk about Stoneham, the New York Giants, the San Francisco Giants. But first, let's welcome Steve to the program. Steve, how you doing?
Hello, Bruce. I really appreciate you letting me in here. It's my great privilege to be able to meet with you and your wonderful audience today.
Now, was I right in saying that you did an ebook a few years ago?
Yeah, probably about 12 or 15 years ago now. Did an ebook through the Hardball Times about the position of third base. Third
That's
base,
right, yeah.
the what was it called? The Crossroads third base. It's still available on ebooks. Look it up.
Okay. Has never been in a print format though?
No, and it's maybe 120 pages or something like that. It's unlike this one. It is a quick read. You can sort of virtually pick up and put down.
So you went from about 120 pages to 428 pages. And with a lot of our author series, we always like to ask the very basic preliminary question: why did you feel motivated to do this subject? I know you've been on the West Coast, you've been someone who has followed the Giants, but why specifically the topic of Horace Stoneham?
Well, it's a great question. I am a born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, a Giants fan since I never had a choice in the matter. My parents were diehard Giants fans, and I was, raised from the womb to be a Giants fan. So that part is a fit. But the owner himself, Horace Stoneham, I knew his name. We knew that the Giants were owned by a guy named Horace Stoneham, but he was not a public figure. We didn't know anything about him at all. And that was the case, not just for me, but for all baseball fans, Giants fans. That was the way he wanted it. He didn't want the limelight like Walter OMalley, like Charlie Finley, like, Branch Rickey, so many other baseball executives. Stoneham was very shy, publicity shy. So nobody really knew about him. So years later, when your paths and mine crossed at websites like Baseball Primer, and we're talking with baseball history about real baseball history, experts, the subject would often come up about Stoneham and about the fact that he was really a big, important figure for decades in the history of Major League Baseball. But not only has nobody ever written his biography, but, very little is actually known about him. Mm-hmm. And we kept saying to each other, that's really a shame. Somebody ought to write that biography. There's a great biography there to be written. Boy, somebody ought to write it. Yeah. So I said that along with all my other buddies for years, until finally, I think it was in 2010 or 11, a friend of mine by the name of Rob Garrett, who has written a great book about the San Francisco Giants called The Home Team. He was doing a bunch of research into the subject, and he sat down with me at dinner and said, Steve, this book about Stoneham needs to be written, and you're the guy to write it. And he was right. I am the guy to write it. Nobody else could possibly, have any deeper nerdy knowledge of the subject than me. So with his assistance, he gave me a lot of his research material that he'd gathered, and he gave me access to the Stoneham family, which was valuable. With that, I started to work on it. It took about, I don't know, 8 or 9 years from there to actual publication date. But
Wow.
I wrote it because it needed to be written. It's a missing link in baseball history.
The book is available at your own website, www.stephentreder.com. Folks can also, of course, go to amazon.com as well. Hardcover book, over 400 pages. You mentioned a moment ago, Steve, that not a lot was known other than surface information about Stoneham. You obviously found a lot. There's a lot of content here, but was it difficult to find factually relevant information about him?
Unfortunately, yes. Unlike his contemporaries, such as the two that come to mind, obviously, are Walter OMalley and Branch Rickey, both of whom were very conscious of their public image and very, very proactive in making sure that they had a good, library of letters and papers, and their story was going to be told. Stoneham never had any of that. I hired a fellow, I'm sure you're a good friend with, Gabriel Schechter.
Oh, yeah.
I hired Gabriel to do some research for me in the Hall of Fame library, and he, worked for weeks and came up with a little, but not a lot, because there's just simply not a lot there. I had to rely on secondary sources because that's all there were. I had the great fortune, as I mentioned earlier, of being able to meet Horace Stone's granddaughters, 3 of them, and they were very helpful in giving me insight, not in his official capacity, but what sort of a person he was. What was his family life like? That was very helpful. But yeah, it would have been a whole lot easier to research had there been a great deal of information cataloged out there, but there really wasn't. It had, a lot of the stuff had to be really dug for.
The 3 granddaughters, do they live in the Bay Area?
The Stoneham house, actually the Rupert house, Horace Stoneham's daughter Mary and her husband Chuck, their house in Atherton, California, it's still in the family. And the youngest granddaughter Kim lives there. So they hosted me at the house and not only told me great stories, but gave me just a treasure trove of photographs and trinkets and artifacts of his life. And then through Kim, I met the 2 other granddaughters, Jamie and Sonia. They were wonderful. And one of the things that became very clear, and I think it's really important in understanding who Horace Stoneham was, his granddaughters loved him, adored him. He was a doting, attentive, gentle, affectionate grandfather to them when they were kids. And so they very much wanted his story to be told, because they felt that the little public image that's out there of Horace Stoneham is not very flattering, and they really wanted the true story to be told. And so one of the elements of Horace Stoneham that I hope comes through in the book is that while he was very shy about public life, he didn't want to be a celebrity. The people who knew him loved him. His family adored him. All of his employees who worked for him for decades were very loyal to Horace Stoneham. He was a person that people who knew him well just loved him. He was a good, friendly, nice person.
Interesting, because I never really heard that aspect of Horace Stoneham. We haven't heard much about his personality prior to your book's publication. Here we have a photograph that you sent me of Stoneham circa 1910. You see him as a young boy. At what point did Horace develop an interest in baseball?
Well, he's just like me. He grew up with it. His dad, Charles Stoneham, who we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a minute, grew up in Jersey City, New Jersey, and was a huge Giants fan. But in fact, he was such a Giants fan, he was probably a fan before they even called the Giants, but they became the Giants in the 1880s. He was a big fan, and he taught his son Horace to be a big fan as well. So Horace was a Giants fan before he could remember. And one of the things that he and his father had in common was going to the Polo Grounds, and his father had a box seat And they went to the Giants games all the time. That was the common bond of their relationship, was their love of baseball and their love of the Giants.
You were mentioning to me this photograph, this early part of the 20th century, and you were saying it was fairly common for young boys to dress in the fashion we see here.
Yes, indeed. I have family photographs of some of my own ancestors similarly. And boys, and this is, I estimate about 1910, because I'm thinking he's maybe 6 or 7 here. You know, that's just a guess on my part. It was not uncommon for boys of the wealthier classes to have their hair grown long and to dress in, well, here he's not exactly in a dress, but certainly not a very masculine costume, the flowers and the gloves and everything. This was very typical in this Edwardian period of this is how upper class boys were dressed.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about Horace's father, Charles, because he had a significant career himself. Here we have a great photo of Stoneham with the legendary Giants manager, John McGraw. This is circa 1930. What was Charles like, both in terms of his ownership style and his personality?
Well, let's start with the personality, because it's one of the most interesting things about this. In personality, Charles and Horace could not possibly have been more different. Horace, as I say, was a nice person. Everybody who knew him loved him. Charles was many things, but he was not nice. Charles was tough. Charles was ruthless. Charles grew up, as I said before, in Jersey City, not from wealth. He was from a sort of a hard scrabble background. Quit school, we don't know when, but probably after about the 6th or 8th grade, something like that. Went to work on Wall Street as a teenager, as what was called a board boy, running messages back between brokerage houses. And he grew up to become a broker of stocks and other securities in the 1890s in Wall Street, when it was just a wild time. There was very, very little regulation. And lots of the activity there was, if not blatantly illegal, then certainly, shady. And Charles was a master of it. He became a multi-millionaire. He became one of the richest men in New York. In a period when $1 million was a lot of money, he had many millions of dollars. He was always plagued by controversy and scandal, always one step ahead of indictment. He ended up being indicted multiple times, though never convicted because of his connections with judges. But he was just a crazy, ruthless, wild character. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby, and it is certainly not beyond the realm of plausibility that Charles A. Stoneham, C.A. Stoneham, was one of the characters that influenced Gatsby in coming up, or influenced Fitzgerald to come up with Gatsby, the character of Gatsby and that world. Charles Stoneham was a very close friend of Arnold Rothstein. They were buddies, and so Charles Stoneham was shall we say, not a straightforward character. A remarkable person, worthy of his own biography for sure.
Yeah. Now, McGraw was a pretty tough guy in his own right. Did he and Charles clash a lot?
They met, we're not sure when, but undoubtedly they met sometime in the 19-teens, when they were both, with the Giants, with gambling and liquor and horses and Havana, all things that they loved. Their paths certainly crossed, and they would have become pals. And it was, when the Giants came up for sale in 1918, McGraw wanted to buy in as a partner, as a partner with a buyer, so he could be part of the ownership team. And so they became partnered that way. They got along very well for the first 5 or so years of the partnership, in which McGraw was allowed to run the baseball operation on his own. Stoneham was behind the scenes. Stoneham gave him the money to operate and kept out of it. By the late 20s, however, that was not working quite so well. Charles Stoneham began to get more involved in the on-field, or the baseball operations. Charles Stoneham, it was his decision to trade away Rogers Hornsby after McGraw had acquired him the year before. That put a wedge in their relationship, and they were never as close after that. But they respected each other until the end. And when McGraw because of failing health, was forced to retire in 1932. Stoneham, treated him with respect, and they parted as friends. But their relationship was complicated.
How about Horace and Charles? You mentioned they're at absolute opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of personality. One is very nice, the other one is much rougher. Did they clash?
Yes and no. They clashed at first. When Charles bought the Giants in January of 1919, he bought them for Horace. He came home and told Horace, who was 16 at the time, he said, "Horace, I just bought you a ball club." And it wasn't just any ball club, of course. It was the Giants, the greatest of all ball clubs, the premier franchise in all of sports at the time. So Horace was thrilled about this, but Horace was also a rich, spoiled kid. And Charles wanted Horace to have what he did not have himself. He wanted to have a college education. So Charles sent Horace off to Fordham University, and Horace drops out. In Horace's telling of the story, he drops out after about 4 days at Fordham. That's probably an exaggeration for the sake of a good story, but Horace dropped out of Fordham and wouldn't go back to college, and Charles was just at his wit's end. How can I get this lazy, spoiled kid of mine to grow up and learn responsibility? Because I wanted to take over the Giants. Finally, after a year or two of this stalemate, Charles came upon an idea, which was, he told Horace, "Horace, if you ever want the Giants," and that got Horace's attention because he did want the Giants, "then you're going to do what I tell you to do. And what you're going to do is you're going to get on a train and you're going to go across the country all by yourself. And you're going to go to Copperopolis, California, in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And you go to a copper mine there that I happen to own. And you're going to work in that copper mine." And so Horace Stoneham, this rich, spoiled, dandy kid from New York who'd never worked a day in his life, went out all on his own to Copperopolis, California, where the miners in Copperopolis, who knows what they might have made of this, dandy fop kid from New York, who was the big boss's son. But it worked. It succeeded at what Charles wanted it to do, which was it forced Horace Stoneham to grow up and stop being a lazy boy and start being a responsible man. In Copperopolis, Horace Stone learned to respect hard work, the people who do it, and learned some discipline himself and come to work on time every day. And he grew up. And it was after that banishment to Copperopolis that Charles finally relented and said, "Okay, you've proven it to me. You can come back to Florida, and you can start working for me, working for the Giants." After that, from that point on, all indications are that their relationship was very close. Horace revered his father and never said a word in disrespect about his father.
Really? Now, Charles passes away, I believe it was 1936, and then Horace takes over. So he was not the reluctant owner. This was something that he had been groomed for. I don't know if Charles's death was unexpected, so maybe the timing may have been a bit of a surprise, but this was clearly the job that Stoneham wanted.
Not only wanted, but had been groomed for. As I say, this was Charles's plan, that Horace would take over. Yeah, Charles Stoneham died at the age of 59, which was, obviously younger than expected, but people died in those days younger than they do now. So Horace was ready. Charles had made a point of it that Horace didn't just have an empty title. He worked for the Giants. He worked in the stadium operations. He worked at every aspect of it. He worked in ticket sales and in groundskeeping, in operations and maintenance, as well as the operation of the ball club, the farm system, the equipment, all of that stuff. Horace learned how to do everything. So that by the time he took over as owner in 1936, he was ready. He was only 32, just not quite 33 years old. Very young, but he was ready for it, and he was eager to do it. It was his life's work. He loved nothing more than the Giants. He took his responsibility very seriously. He believed that he was, and his responsibility was to do the very best he could for the Giants, and he endeavored his very best to do that as for the next 40 years.
One of the characteristics of Stoneham was that he was both the owner and the general manager for much of his time with New York and San Francisco. That is something that would be unheard of in today's game. But Horace was able to handle both roles.
And even at that time, it was very unusual. There were a couple of other owners who did a similar thing. Clark Griffith and then Calvin Griffith with the Washington Senators, who became Minnesota Twins. That was kind of a similar arrangement. And Connie Mack in Philadelphia, he was the owner, the manager, and the general manager. But that was about it. In Bill Terry was the Giants' field manager and general manager when Horace inherited the team. But in 1942, when Terry retired from baseball, Horace never replaced him. He just quietly, without announcement or fanfare, just assumed the role. And he was the guy in charge. He ran the operation in every detail up until the day he sold the team in 1976. So we have to understand, the history of Horace Stoneham isn't just as a franchise owner, not just as a capitalist investor in the business, but also as an operator. He was a competitor for championships. He was a competitive general manager competing with Branch Rickey and George Weiss and Gabe Paul and all the other general managers in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. That was the realm in which he competed, trying to make the Giants a competitive team. And so as a general manager, he wasn't perfect, but he was very good. He had a lot of strengths, and the Giants were consistently one of the better competitive teams throughout his entire ownership.
So he didn't just have cursory knowledge of baseball, even in those early years. I mean, he was qualified to be the GM.
And there was nothing in the world he loved more than baseball and the Giants. He watched every game, every spring training game, every regular season game. I mean, I'm sure there's a time or two when he was ill and he couldn't, but this was his normal daily routine. He not only watched every game, but watched in great detail. He absorbed every detail. He understood very deeply how baseball games are won and lost, what it takes to be competitive, how players, what the technique is they should be exhibiting at the various positions, everything about baseball. He was extremely knowledgeable. This is the major part of his public image, his legacy, that's just not known. The public image of Stoneham is he was a nice guy, a friendly fellow, a drinking buddy to many in the game, but not a deep thinker, a lightweight. That's not true at all. He was very smart and very hardworking and very disciplined, and he really, really knew his craft.
Did the other owners feel they could take advantage of him because of this misperception?
Sports writers love to spin that yarn, but that wasn't true at all. The other owners respected Horace's knowledge and acumen. In my book, I quote none other than Bill Veeck to this end. Bill Veeck, of course, is his own father. Bill Veeck Sr. owned the Cubs when Charles owned the Giants, and Bill Veeck Jr. knew Horace Stoneham very, very well for years and years and years. They were very close. And Bill Veeck, as we know, was not one prone to, refrain from criticizing baseball owners who he felt weren't very sharp. Bill Veeck would say it if he thought baseball owners or operators weren't as sharp as Bill Veeck was. But Bill Veeck never said anything like that about Horace Stoneham. In fact, in his own books, Bill Veeck wrote that he highly respected Horace Stoneham, was wary of him when they would engage in any kind of a trade negotiation, because he felt that Stoneham was the kind of guy who loved to play on his image of, being kind of gullible, and he would allow you to think you were taking advantage of him when in fact he was thinking one step ahead of you, and he would convince you to do exactly what he wanted to do all along. That was Bill Veeck's characterization of Horace Stoneham.
Now, by the time Horace took over as owner in 1936, John McGraw had retired as manager. So who was the Giants manager at that time?
It was Bill Terry. Bill Terry was McGraw's handpicked successor. Bill Terry was at the time, of course, not only the field manager, but he took over as field manager for McGraw, but he was still the star first baseman, batting fourth and playing every day. And then once Terry retired as a player, he continued as the field manager and the general manager, which was the standard operating principle at the time. When Terry decided he no longer wanted to be field manager, but just wanted to focus 100% on general manager, Terry and Stoneham hired Mel Ott in 1941 to be the field manager as well as the star player. Not one of Horace Stoneham's most wise decisions, and that Mel Ott, everybody loved Mel Ott. He's a great guy, great player, wonderful person. Probably not the person cut out to be a field manager. But that was Horace's first hire as field manager.
Later, we see Leo Durocher come in. Completely different personality.
Could not
at times got along very well with Stoneham, but other times not.
Durocher was everything Ott was not. And it was a measure of Stoneham's frustration with the status that the Giants were in mid-1948. They weren't going anywhere. They were being outcompeted in New York by the Dodgers and the Yankees. They were, they needed to shake things up. And so Stoneham did the unthinkable, which is to reach across town and hire Durocher away from the Dodgers to come manage the Giants. Durocher was brilliant and mercurial and energetic and all those wonderful things. He was also impossibly egotistical and very, very difficult to get along with. A very different personality from Horace Stoneham. They got along well. They respected each other and worked well as a working partnership for most of the period together. But with, as is the case with Durocher's life and career, after 5 or 6 years of that, the relationship was wearing thin. And by 1955, Durocher had publicly humiliated Stoneham more than once, and they were not getting along well at all. And when Durocher's contract expired at the end of the 1955 season, he was pointedly not asked to return.
Interesting. A little bit before that, we have the Giants signing of, I guess their most iconic player, Willie Mays. Was that a Stoneham signing? Were there other people involved in bringing him on? How exactly did that come about?
That's a great question, great story. We know that, of course, Branch Rickey and the Dodgers were the first Major League franchise to racially integrate. And following that was Bill Veeck with the Indians, and then a very aborted attempt by the Browns in 1947 that they gave up on after just a month. So in 1949, there were still only 2 integrated teams in Major League Baseball. It wasn't at all clear that racial integration was going to become a normal thing as we know it eventually would. It wasn't all clear then that it would. But in 1949, the Giants integrated. This was Stoneham's initiative. They brought in Monty Irvin and Hank Thompson. But more importantly than that, they also, the Polo Grounds, which was of course owned by Stoneham and the Giants, the Polo Grounds was the home ballpark for the New York Cuban Giants, the New York Negro League franchise. And the owner there was a fellow by the name of Alejandro Alex Pompez. Stoneham was his landlord. They knew each other well. Once Major League Baseball, white Major League Baseball, begins to racially integrate, Pompez was smart enough to realize this is a death knell for the Negro Leagues. So what is he going to do? Well, he and Stoneham figured out an exit strategy for Pompez and the Negro Leagues, which was that they partnered. And Stoneham began to rely upon Pompez as one of his inner circle of advisors. He eventually hired Pompez. In 1949, they made the New York Cuban Giants a farm club, and in 1951, he hired Pompez directly on payroll as part of his front office, which was decades ahead of any other Major League franchise having a black man, not just a black man, but a Latin American, a Cuban American, a Spanish speaker. And so this gave the Giants a huge entry into African American baseball and Latin American baseball. It was through the Pompez portal that the Giants began to actively scout in the Negro Leagues, and it was through that actively scouting the Negro Leagues that in the spring of 1950, the Giants didn't actually stumble upon Willie Mays themselves. The Braves found him first, but the Braves were unable to secure a release of Mays from the Birmingham Black Barons, from whom he was playing. So they gave up on him. but the brave scout told the Giants scout, look, there's this kid, Willie Mays Jr., you got to sign him. Don't ask questions, just sign him. This scout, oh gosh, now I'm blanking on his name, but it's in the book. He watches Mays play one time, and that's all he needs. And he calls up the front office. It was actually Jack Schwartz who answered the phone back in New York, and he just said, you are not going to, you must sign this kid. And so Stoneham and the Giants succeeded in purchasing Mays's services from the Birmingham Black Barons and signing him within a matter of days. Somebody else was going to get Mays if the Giants did, but it was the Giants' proactive initiative in actively scouting the African American community that got the Giants the greatest player in their franchise history, and one of the handful of 3 or 4 greatest players ever to play the game.
That's interesting. You bring up Mays, you bring up Pompez, and you did mention that Pompez not only opened the door for the Giants to have this pipeline of African American players, but also we start to see Latino ball players coming in 1950s, but especially in the 1960s with Cepeda, the Alou brothers, Marichal. Stoneham obviously was a guy who was open to all this. He was looking to improve the team. He wasn't just looking to maintain the old ways.
Yeah, and he and Chub Feeney would be the first to admit, that their purposes were not altruistic. They weren't trying to racially integrate and culturally integrate the Giants because they just felt it was the right thing to do, although I think they did feel it was the right thing to do. That wasn't their primary motivation. Their primary motivation was to be successful competitively. They had to compete against the Dodgers and the Yankees and all the other teams in the National League, and they were trying to get talent. So that was the motivation. But Stoneham was eagerly interested in the baseball talent that the Caribbean had to offer. He himself often went down to the Dominican Republic, to Cuba, to Mexico, to Venezuela. He was as actively interested in this stuff as anybody. He loved baseball year round. He once the weather got cold up in the States, he wanted to watch baseball, so he spent his falls and winters in the Caribbean. So it wasn't just because he felt that they had to, although he did. He loved it. He wanted to do it. And therefore, through Pompez and through that huge network of scouts and relationships, the Giants were the best, the most comprehensively integrated organization in baseball through the 1950s and 60s. Other organizations, were forced competitively to try and catch up with the Giants, but it wasn't until the 60s that other organizations were as active as the Giants had been for years. And so this netted the Giants the pipeline that brought them Orlando Cepeda, Juan Marichal, the Alou brothers, Jose Cardinal, on and on. That was because of Pompez and Stoneham.
We know that DeRocher and Mays were very close. DeRocher loved Mays. Similar in terms of Stoneham, he and Mays got along pretty much throughout.
Yes, Stoneham was a very paternalistic owner who loved all of his players, to a fault, perhaps. He was generous with them. He wanted them to not just succeed, but to be happy, to be well provided for. Mays, Stoneham recognized the difficulty that Mays would be dealing with as a young Black man far away from home in the 50s. So he really made sure that Mays was well cared for, and Mays understood that and greatly appreciated it. Mays, throughout his Giants career, was extremely well paid, but as a young man, Mays had very little fiscal discipline and overspent even his big salary, and so was almost always taking advances from Stoneham. Stoneham would pay him advances on future salary to make sure Mays could pay his bills. And Mays, once again, understood that and appreciated that. It's difficult to exactly put a term around it. It wasn't father-son. It wasn't a fatherly relationship, but it was a protector, a big brother, not just an employer, but more than that. they were close, and they respected each other. It was a good, positive relationship.
I want to talk, Steve, about some non-players and their relationships with Charles Stone, or with Horace Stoneham, I should say. Here we have a great photo of Stoneham on the right, with Charles Chubb Feeney on the left. Feeney in later years would become president of the National League, but in the 1950s worked for the Giants. This is something interesting. I know that you knew this years ago, and I just realized it researching for this interview. Charles Feeney's middle name was Stoneham. He was part of the family.
He was Horace's nephew.
Yeah.
He was the son of Horace's younger sister. I'm not sure of exactly what the circumstances were, but it's pretty apparent that Chubb Feeney's father was not caring for him, and so Horace kind of took him under his wing as his uncle. Chubb Feeney was the Giants' bat boy when he was a kid in the 1930s. Horace made sure that Chubb Feeney got a college education, which Horace never did. But Chubb Feeney went to Dartmouth and got a law degree, in fact, from Dartmouth. But as soon as he graduated in 1946, he came to work for the Giants and worked for the Giants. His official title through the 50s and 60s was he was the general manager, but he was not the general manager in the sense that we understand it within baseball, and that he wasn't the guy in charge of making trades and fashioning the roster. That was Horace Stoneham's job. But it was Chubb Feeney's job to execute all of Horace Stoneham's, orders. And so he ran the operation. He was the administrative manager of the Giants throughout the 1950s and 60s. He was very competent and intelligent and hardworking and well-respected throughout all of baseball. That was why in 1969, when the Giants were beginning to have financial difficulty and Stoneham wasn't confident in his ability to continue to be able to employ Chubb Feeney and provide for him in the manner in which he felt he was accustomed, that it was Walter OMalley and Horace Stoneham who engineered Chubb Feeney to be elected as the president of the National League. Their first choice was to have him be elected as commissioner of baseball. The American League didn't agree to go along with that, but once that opportunity was no longer there, then he became the president of the National League.
I should probably know more about Charles Feeney, Chubb Feeney, as he was often referred to. What was his personality like?
I had the great fortune of interviewing both his son and his late daughter, Katie Feeney, who worked for the National League, I believe, in New York.
Yeah.
Chubb Feeney was not quite as nice as Horace was. Nobody was as nice as Horace was, but he was a genial fellow, well respected throughout the game for his, integrity, cordiality, just a good person who knew everybody, got along with everybody. Not a innovator, not a brilliant strategist, not a idealist. He was very practical. He was very competent. He got things done. When the order was given, we need to do this, Chubb Feeney was the guy who without drama, without difficulty, he just got everything done. He was a good person.
Yeah. Well, you need people like that in good organizations. Let's talk about this man, Tootshore. I remember growing up in the 70s, hear my father tell stories about Tootshore and the restaurant that he had in New York City. All the great athletes went there, congregated there. He and Horace became friends, but you said they actually were best of friends.
They were best friends, which I didn't realize. I'd heard sort of, stories about Horace Stoneham and Tootshore, but never really took them seriously because Tootshore was friends with everybody until I met the Stoneham granddaughters and came across not just this photograph, but others. Tootshore was the godfather to the young lady between Horace Stoneham and Tootshore. There was Mary Stoneham, Horace's daughter. Tootshore was the goddaughter to Mary Stoneham's babies. That's how close they were. They were best friends. When Tootshore, he himself is just a great story. He was this tough New York, big, you can see he was a big guy. He was a bouncer when he was younger. He grew up, in the tough, hard saloon business. tough Jew with the heart of gold, character from literature. That's who he was. When he wanted to own his own barn and restaurant in New York, it was Horace Stoneham who loaned him the money to allow that to happen. And Horace Stoneham was Tootshoore's best customer. He was always in his restaurant, and Tootshore loved to host not just the owner of the Giants, because Toots was a Giants fan at heart, but everybody came to Toots's place in New York. Joe DiMaggio and Leo DeRocher and, all the ball players when they were on the road trips coming through, and all the football teams, the boxers, everybody. Tootshore's place was the place to go. And Horace Stoneham was there. That was the hangout. They were best friends. When Horace Stoneham very reluctantly had to move the franchise to San Francisco, Tootshore and his wife came to San Francisco and were guests of Horace Stoneham at the opening game in Seal Stadium. That's how close they were.
Wow. You mentioned that players like DiMaggio would go there. You had players from the Yankees, you had players from the Dodgers. But I guess Toots's preference was the Giants in large part because of Stoneham.
Because of Stoneham, because Toots himself grew up a New York Giants fan. That was his team. They loved Mel Ott, of course. Mel Ott was a great friend that they had in common. When Mel Ott died in a terrible, tragic car crash in 1958, it devastated them both. And I tell a story in the book that Horace, once he heard about the death, he called up Toots. It was his first phone call, and they wept together over the phone about the loss of their great friend Mel Ott. They were once again, Horace Stone's a complicated guy.
Yeah.
He's not easy to figure out. Different in personality from a very outgoing, very publicity conscious fellow like Tootshore, but they got along very well. They knew each other and respected each other, and we're lifelong friends.
This photo epitomizes that. It looks like Toots is in the middle of saying something. He's got a wide grin. He's pointing with his program. And Horace Stoneham, 2 places to the right, is just sort of crouching a little bit and kind of looking away. He's not saying anything. It kind of sums it up.
I love this photograph. It speaks 10,000 words. Mary Stoneham, Wuchi, they called her, Stoneham's adored daughter, his favorite, is in between them, and she and Toots are obviously yucking it up over something. The fellow to Horace's left there, with the cigarette in his mouth, that's Chuck Rupert. That's Mary's husband, the father of Horace's grandson. The fellow who Horace Stoneham would later, after Chuck Rupert had a very distinguished career in the United States Air Force, when Chuck Rupert retired from the Air Force, Horace brought him into the family business, and he worked for Horace in the front office up until the day that Horace sold the franchise. So the Giants were not just a business; they were a family, and this really sort of epitomizes that whole image of Horace and the way he loved it to be.
This brings us to Walter OMalley, another great photo here. After the 57 season, both the Giants and the Dodgers moved to California. For years, we've heard this narrative that this was orchestrated by OMalley, that he was the mover and shaker. He wanted to relocate the franchise. He convinced the Giants and Stoneham to basically go along, just do the same so that we can have kind of another partner out there, another team that we can play with. They'll be close to us geographically. Not exactly true, though, according to your research.
No, it's a great illustration, though, of how the public image, got way ahead of the facts here and was allowed to remain that way for decades because Horace Stoneham didn't care. He didn't care about the public image. He didn't care about how he was caricatured, and wasn't important to him that he was publicly understood to be sort of a, kind of a bumbler, of a lucky idiot, kind of OMalley's pet. That's simply not true at all. Stone was going to move the Giants. In fact, he was more adamant about moving the Giants than OMalley was about moving the Dodgers. Stoneham was taking the initiative. OMalley was I think, sincerely trying to figure out a way to get a new ballpark built for the Dodgers in New York. Stoneham kind of made some, motions in that direction, but I think he gave up on that more quickly than OMalley did. And Stoneham was looking for places to relocate the Giants before OMalley was. It is true, however, that eventually in early 1957, it was OMalley who came to Stoneham and said, okay, look, let's stop kidding around here. The right move for both of us is for both of us to move together to California for all the reasons that you articulated. It was a way of keeping the rivalry, the rivalry was always a manufactured thing by the teams. It sold tickets. It was good for business. And they could maintain that in California. Los Angeles and San Francisco are perfect natural rivals. The Los Angeles and San Francisco markets, the California market in general, was far more lucrative than Horace could have found. The other place he was probably going to move the team would be Minneapolis, St. Paul. San Francisco was a better market than that. So it was just a good thing for them both to go together. So it was OMalley who formally proposed it, but the fact that Stoneham immediately said yes, did not hesitate at all, didn't have to think it over, strongly suggests that Stoneham had been thinking along the same lines for a long time. And so once that was decided, it was just a question of working out the details, which they did within a matter of a couple of months. And by the spring of 1957, it was a fait accompli.
Did Horace feel, A, the Polo Grounds were no longer a viable place to play baseball? And B, did he think that with the Yankees also being in town, that maybe New York was not the ideal market anymore?
Yes, both of those things were true. The issue with the Polo Grounds, which is the same as the issue with Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, isn't so much that the ballparks were starting to get old and rickety by the 1950s, although that was part of it. The primary issue was parking. By the 1950s, the automobile had revolutionized the way that most American families, undertook their daily transportation. By the 1950s, having a car was normal, which it hadn't been before. By the 1950s, if you were going to get somebody from the suburbs to come into New York and attend your game, they weren't going to take the train. They were going to drive their car. And if they were going to drive their car, they needed a place to park their car safely and securely. And they needed a freeway to drive into the city, without traffic jams. The Polo Grounds in Ebbets Field offered none of that. And this wasn't just true of New York and the Giants and the Dodgers. This was the same issue in Philadelphia and Boston and, all the other cities for which it was becoming economically difficult for major league teams to do business in the 50s. Their ballparks didn't accommodate automobiles. So the promise of the new ballpark for Stoneham in San Francisco was not only that it would be a new ballpark, but that it would be a ballpark that was accessible to automobiles. It would be surrounded by an enormous parking lot, that it would be served by a modern freeway. And that was the deciding factor that motivated both Stoneham and OMalley. Not just to move out of New York, but to move to where the automobile would be, far more readily accommodated than New York at the time was capable of doing.
Steve, as we move to our next slide, I actually want to bring in one of the questions from the audience, and I'll let Steve Weisensail, will use his words in introducing this. Stephen writes, to Steve, thank you for your book and this presentation. Can you comment on Stoneham's connection to Japanese baseball, both before and after the Masanori Murakami affair, 1964 and 65? Steve, pick it up there with Lefty O'Doul.
Yes, great question. The fellow on the left there in the left photograph is the great Lefty O'Doul, who Stoneham, like everybody in baseball, Stoneham knew O'Doul very, very well. They're very close. They met in initially the 1920s when O'Doul had his first tour of duty as a player with the Giants, but then they got to know each other very well in the 1930s. And of course, O'Doul then went to San Francisco, became the manager of the Seals, but O'Doul's real primary mission throughout his career was to really foster strong relationships between American baseball and Japanese baseball. The Yomiuri Giants were named the Yomiuri Giants because Lefty O'Doul named them. He named them in honor of the New York Giants. And they had the New York Giants logo and color scheme and all that because of O'Doul and because of Stoneham's Giants. So there's a close connection there. just like Stoneham loved baseball in the Caribbean and Latin America and saw it as a great place for him to harvest talent for the Giants. Stoneham loved baseball in Japan and had an ideal that the Giants would be able to recruit baseball players from Japan just as they had from Latin America. It was through O'Doul's connection that the Giants were the first team to, not just an all-star team, but an intact major league team. They toured Japan first in 1953, then again in 1960. That's the photograph on the left there. O'Doul had broken his leg, but was on crutches. Wouldn't stop him from going on the tour. And then again in 1970, the picture on the right, O'Doul would have been involved in that tour, but sadly he passed away in December of '69. Those tours were Stoneham's way of building relationships, fostering the relationships with the Japanese teams and owners, but also he felt establishing a channel, a pipeline from which he could recruit Japanese players. He recruited Masanori Murakami to come play for the Giants in 1964. And Murakami was sensational. He was great. He was far better than anybody had anticipated he would be, such that Stoneham's Giants thought that they could just keep him. But this was a profound misunderstanding. That was not the agreement that the Nankai Hawks, Murakami's team in Japan, had understood it to be. They thought they were loaning Murakami to the Giants so he could gain experience playing for the Giants farm system, but not that he would pursue his major league career there. So that episode ended badly in that Murakami was allowed to play one full season for the Giants in 1965, and following that season, he was given the choice of where he wanted to go. But being a good Japanese young man, he was gonna play in Japan, and he played out his career in Japan. So that one didn't go as well as hoped, but still, Stoneham never gave up the dream that he was going to be able to use Japanese baseball in the same way that he had leveraged Latin American baseball as a source of playing talent for the Giants to, once again, to be a competitive advantage for the Giants. Now, the Japanese baseball ownership, they saw that coming. They recognized that that's exactly what Stoneham and other owners, OMalley was thinking along the same lines. And so they didn't allow it to happen. They set up a structure that had never been put into place in Latin American baseball, where they controlled the contracts, and no Japanese prospect went to the United States for decades. It wasn't until the 1990s when Dodgers signed, his name,
Hideo Nomo.
Hideo Nomo. That was finally when that dynamic changed. But Stoneham, if Stoneham had his way, the Giants would have been recruiting Japanese players all along.
Murakami was very good for the Giants late in '64 and then throughout '65. He struck out over a batter per inning, very effective relief pitcher. You mentioned that the Nankai team, they wanted Murakami back. We had Murakami here a few years ago, and the impression that we got from him was that he also felt kind of a duty, an obligation to go back to Nankai. Not that he was unhappy with the Giants, but he really felt like, this is the team that brought me up, the Nankai Hawks.
Yep.
I kind of owe it to them to go back there. You think that was a factor as well?
It's absolutely a factor. And a lot of it is the Japanese culture, which is very beholden to the family and to the organizational structure and, the institution. And so Murakami, felt obligated to do what his elders wanted him to do, which was to honor his home country and pursue his career in Japan. He felt torn. He loved playing for the Giants. He thought the Giants treated him properly, but no, his duty was to be a good Japanese and to play in Japan. It's interesting. His 2 seasons with the Giants, 64, 65, at the age he was, he projected to be a major star. He looked like he was going to be just a great pitcher. He had a good career in Japan. He was a good journeyman, but he never became the star it appeared he would. And he's a pitcher. Pitchers hurt their arms. This is always going to be the way it is. But at the time, it looked like this guy was going to be a Hall of Fame talent. Both, and by the way, the Japanese baseball felt the same way. They did not want to lose this superstar talent to the United States.
It would have made a nice number 3 starter behind Perry and Marichal.
Yes,
We have just a few minutes remaining with Steve Treder. Fascinating talk about the longtime Giants owner, Horace Stoneham. When the Giants made the move to San Francisco in '58, they initially played at Seal Stadium, but then in the early 60s, they moved into this ballpark, Candlestick Park. I know you were there many, many times. I only saw Candlestick on TV. It always looked nice on TV. But then you talk to people who were there. They talked about the wind and the cold and the sight lines. When did the Giants first become disenchanted with Candlestick?
The very first day they took batting practice there in April of 1960. It was terrible. There is no sugarcoating it. There is no, yeah, it wasn't so good, but no, every single thing about this ballpark was awful. Well, the one thing about it that met the expectation was, as you can see here in this photograph, it was surrounded by acres of parking. That part was good. But you can also see on the upper left corner there, you see that little 2-lane road. That was the access point from the freeway to the parking lot.
Wow.
So the traffic was miserable. The whole story behind it is, I won't go into detail here, but it was corrupt from the get-go. The reason the ballpark was built there was because of a corrupt deal between the developer and the city government. It was a way to put tax dollars in the developer's pocket. He bought land at pennies per acre and sold it back to the city for thousands per acre so that he could be the no-bid contractor to build the facility there. It was just crooked from the first moment. The reason the ballpark was built there is because it was the worst weather in the entire Bay Area. It was windy and foggy and terrible. There was nothing good about it. The ballpark itself was flawed in design and construction. It was terrible. It was terrible. It was one of the problems the Giants had in attracting and retaining fans. They were able to succeed there for 10 years before the A's arrived because there was nothing else in the Bay Area. But once the A's arrived and were a direct competitor for the Giants for attendance, Candlestick Park's, it was a dead weight on the Giants. And it really, really was one of the key factors that forced Stoneham to eventually face bankruptcy and eventually be forced to sell his beloved franchise.
Stoneham sells the team just before the 1976 season. Well, he finalized it at that point. He'd been trying to sell the team for quite a while, sold it to a man named Bob Lurie. You make the point in the book that he had no choice because he didn't have any money. The franchise was going nowhere. It was not profitable, so he had to sell. He had to leave after 40 years within the game. As you look back at the legacy of someone like Horace Stoneham, you think of Stoneham, what he did, what he contributed to the game. How would you sum up his legacy in a paragraph?
He was one of the most important figures in professional baseball in the 20th century. He was every bit as impactful on the development of Major League Baseball as several of his contemporaries who are far better known, people like Branch Rickey and Walter OMalley and George Weiss and Tom Yawkey. Stoneham deserves every bit the fame and renown that they have. Stoneham absolutely belongs in the Hall of Fame as an executive. He was an innovator in the racial and cultural integration of the sport. He, along with Bill Veeck, invented or founded the Cactus League in Arizona. He was hugely impactful. He wasn't always successful. He was good, but not great. But anybody who wants to understand thoroughly the development and the course that professional baseball took throughout the 20th century must know Horace Stoneham's story. It's integral.
Not a self-promoter, not a guy who maybe talked about himself as much as he should, and it's cost him in terms of his reputation, but hopefully your book sheds some new light on that.
That's the plan. That's what I hope to do. And I hope people along with honoring Horace Stoneham, just learned serious of Major League Baseball was at the time, and the way the
We're
course.
starting to lose Steve's signal just as we wrap things up. We do want to remind you, you can get the book, www.stephentreder.com. That's Steve's website. You can also go to amazon.com and just type in 40 Years a Giant, The Life of Horace Stoneham. A lot of great baseball history, revealing biography. Steve, thank you. We really appreciate your time. Great job.
Bruce, it's my great privilege. I greatly appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
All right. Our guest, Steve Treder, author of 40 Years a Giant. Now, it's only taken 8 or 9 years to put this one together, so we've got to get Steve working on another project. We thank Steve Treder. We thank the Ford Motor Company for their generous support. We thank all of you for listening and watching. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.